that, I would like to introduce our first speaker, my new friend and independent scholar, John Mills. John, please.
Before I start speaking with my prepared remarks, I just want to say what an honor it is that the museum and the cemetery asked me to speak here today. I've been researching this story for some time now, and I am humbled to be able to do this. So thank you. A fortune story. Sometime in the mid-1700s, a woman gave birth to a son. The specific date where that occurred, who that mother was, none of that is known. What we do know is that child would eventually be referred to as Fortune. The first documented reference we have of Fortune's existence begins in the 1790s. He would have likely been in his 50s. A 1788 Connecticut law required enslavers to record the birth of every child of their enslaved. The intent was to guarantee their freedom during the period of gradual emancipation. Due to that requirement, Fortune's enslaver, Dr. Preserve Porter, registered the birth dates of Fortune's 4 children. His eldest, a son named Africa, his second son, Jacob, and 2 daughters, Mira and Roxy. Fortune lived with his wife, Dinah, and 4 children in a small dwelling house 80 rods east of the dwelling of his enslaver, Dr. Preserve Porter. Dr. Porter was a Waterbury surgeon and bone setter, one of a long line of doctors. His 2 brothers were also doctors. His father was a doctor. His grandfather was a doctor and an original settler of Waterbury. And his great-grandfather was a bone setter in Farmington. There are historical references of Fortune and his family within the Waterbury community. His son Africa is documented in Volume 1 of Joseph Anderson's 1896 book, The Town and City of Waterbury, as being responsible for ringing the town's school bell for 3 months in 1790. Also, Fortune appears to have been a man of faith. His baptism recorded by St. John's Episcopal Church on December 20, 1797. In 1798, Fortune's death was notated in the personal records of Waterbury resident Benjamin Upson, who took it upon himself only a year prior to begin recording local deaths, which is the only reason we know the year Fortune died. Many years later, a skeleton would be referenced in Volume 2 of Joseph Anderson's 1896 book, referred to as Larry. According to Anderson, Larry was an enslaved man belonging to Dr. Preserve Porter who slipped from a rock at the river and drowned. As the story was told, Dr. Porter prepared and preserved the skeleton, doing the work at the place where the accident occurred. Dr. Porter would then open a school of anatomy, using the skeleton as a training tool. We now know that skeleton was actually Fortune. Upon Dr. Porter's death in 1803, Fortune's wife, Dinah, is one of only 2 remaining enslaved by Dr. Porter. Dinah is listed in Dr. Porter's probate inventory as having a value of $10. Fortune's skeleton is listed with a value of $15. There is no indication of what became of Fortune's 4 children, and by 1810, there is no record of Dinah. Fortune, however, would begin a post-mortem journey of continuous possession that would span the next 2 centuries. Fortune's bones were willed to Dr. Porter's son Jesse, who was also a Waterbury doctor. Jesse and his wife Comfort are also buried here at Riverside Cemetery. We next pick up the bones in the possession of Jesse Porter's grandson, Dr. Homer Law, who studied medicine in Philadelphia, lived in New York for most of his life, and spent his final years in Hartford. Thus, Fortune's bones likely traversed 3 states over that span. Dr. Law and his wife Adelia are also buried here at Riverside Cemetery. In the 1870s, Dr. Law would use the bones to teach anatomy to his daughter, Dr. Sally McLannan. Sally would later refer to the bones as almost her first plaything as a child, keeping the bones with her all of her life. Dr. McLannan would eventually attend Johns Hopkins Medical School in Baltimore, where she would marry and remain. Thus, after death, and through all of the 1800s, Fortune remained in free service to the Porter family, his bones traveling with those intent upon following in the family tradition of medicine, from Waterbury to Philadelphia, to New York, to Hartford, and now to Baltimore. In 1932, possibly inspired by her husband's donations of his ancestral antiques to Baltimore's Peel Museum, Dr. Sally McGlannon started a dialogue with the director of the Mattatuck Museum, Ross and Hack. Agreeing to pay for the display, Dr. McGlannon shipped the skeleton having Larry written across its skull, wrapped in fresh tissue paper, and arriving at the Mattatuck Museum on October 28, 1932. Excited about the skeleton, Mr. Haddon felt the most interesting thing to do would be to secure the bones together and install them in a case. So once again, fortune traveled. Mr. Haddon sent the bones to Germany for articulation, where the hammering and screwing in of wires and hardware occurred to hold each bone together, replicating the way they connected and functioned in a living body. On its return, the skeleton would be placed on display as Larry, aligning with what was written across the skull. In 1938, Mr. Haddon communicated to Dr. McGlannon that the skeleton carried away all honors in attracting attention at the museum. But of note, he mentioned that the most enthusiastic audience seemed to be made up of, as he put it, very young and excitable Negroes. Yet reassuring Dr. McGlannon that Waterbury's Negro population was not that extensive. The skeleton would remain on display, persisting for the next 32 years. Sometimes standing next to farm tools, other times positioned seated on a small stool. It was also displayed on a popular postcard sold by the museum. In 1970, out of respect for the remains and sensibility of the community, the skeleton was removed from public display and placed in storage where it would remain for over 20 years. In the early 1990s, realizing there was little documented of Waterbury's African American history, Ms. Maxine Watts, of the Waterbury chapter of the NAACP, asked the Mattatuck Museum to lead a project to locate and record the lives of the city's eldest African Americans. Known as the African American Oral History Project, committee members reported the stories of over 40 residents, 80 years of age and above. As the committee finished their work, a local resident reminded them of a much older African American in the city, providing an old postcard from the museum depicting a skeleton referred to as Larry. After over 20 years, the bones were pulled from storage for study. The committee sought the assistance of anthropologists, archaeologists, other scientists, and historians to determine who Larry was and how he lived. By 1996, their research had determined that the skeleton was actually Fortune. Known now as the Fortune Project, Fortune again traveled. He was examined by the Connecticut State archaeologists at the University of Connecticut at Storrs. Fortune traveled to Washington, D.C. to be examined by experts at Howard University. He traveled to Oklahoma for examination by experts at the University of Oklahoma. He was examined by experts at Central Connecticut State University, Quinnipiac University, and Hampshire College in Massachusetts. From the bones, they ultimately learned that in life, Fortune stood around 5'6" tall and was in his mid-50s or older when he died. Based on the density of his bones, they knew he was a very strong man. Informed by the wear in areas where muscle once attached, and by the many fractures that had healed prior to death, they knew he was worked hard and likely experienced pain in life. In 2012, after nearly 20 years of research and examination, the committee made the decision to lay Fortune to rest. St. John's Episcopal Church donated the burial plot, and Alderson's Funeral Home donated the casket. But before services were performed, Fortune would travel one last time. On September 12, 2013, Fortune would make his way to the Connecticut State Capitol in Hartford, where he would lay in state before being escorted by state police to St. John's Episcopal Church here in Waterbury, the very parish where he was baptized in December of 1797. Fortune took his final rest here, amongst 18th and 19th century elite of Waterbury society, including some who held his bones, resting here being something that could have never happened at the time of his death 225 years ago. I see Fortune's story as an American story, one that reminds us of our history and enslavement, the sentiment of human possession that reverberated long after its demise, the challenges created by lack of documentation afforded those considered of lesser value, and the ancestral disconnections it created, impacting the ability for many African Americans to find their ancestors today. So today we commemorate the 10-year anniversary of Fortune's final rest, providing him with the honor, dignity, and reverence he deserved in life, and acknowledging the 215 years of non-consented service he provided after his death. May God continue to allow him to rest in eternal peace. And now I would like to bring up Father Nick Combs from St. John's Episcopal Church, who will give us the blessing. Thank you.